And Leah Wright Rigueur, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me, Claire.
Well, we were up late last night and we're up early this morning, shades of the convention. I just want to introduce you to my viewers. Neil J. Young can't be with us today, but I'm delighted to have Leah Wright Rigueur, who is the SNF Agora Institute Associate Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University. She's the author of The Loneliness of the Black Republican, and she's a political commentator in numerous print and television outlets, including CNN, MSNBC, and PBS, which will all be claiming her time today. And because she is, most importantly, my friend, she agreed to appear on the Political Junkies videocast. So just to give our viewers a little wrap up, Leah, 54 days to Election Day. And before we get to last night's debate, we're going to want to catch our viewers up. Before the debate, 538.com had Vice President Harris up a little less than 3 points going into last night. It's essentially a dead heat, and we're going to be really interested to see whether the debate moved the needle at all, whether it brought some of those 15 to 18% of uncommitted and swing voters over to the Democratic side. We also got an endorsement from Taylor Swift last night. She finally unbelted with that one. Do you think Beyonce is gonna jump in?
You know, I think Beyonce is waiting for the inauguration. I think
Oh
she
God.
wants to see, she wants to ensure a Kamala victory before she agrees. And then once she does that, oh yeah, she'll definitely be performing lots of red, white, and blue, and spangles and
Mm-hmm.
sparkles, and so we should look for her in January 2025. Not
Okay.
quite yet though.
Okay. So she'll be singing "Freedom" at the inauguration.
Exactly.
And particularly since she got totally dissed by the Country Music Association, right? I mean, she got like no nominations for what is, in fact, a brilliant album.
Yeah, so no, absolutely snubbed. And it's remarkable because she very much this whole Americana, country music, country roots. I'm just as American as you is very much rooted in, or very much tied to the angle that Kamala Harris is taking right now, that kind of progressive patriotism that Wes Moore talks about so often. Democrats are reclaiming nationalism, but
Mm-hmm.
in a progressive sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I would not be surprised if we see an explicit Beyonce Kamala collaboration sometime in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you completely. And I have sort of two comments because I am, of course, ancient compared to your youth. But I kind of feel like Black women are not just coming into their own in American political culture, but really taking a leadership role in taking us to a new place, the new place that we need to go in terms of both intellectual acuity and civility. What do you
I
think?
I absolutely think so. So I think one of the things that people don't talk enough about is the fact that Kamala Harris launched her or accepted the nomination to be the Democratic nominee for President of the United States on August 22nd, 2024,
Right.
60 years to the day after Fannie Lou Hamer delivers her speech to the Credentials Committee of the Democratic National Convention. And while I don't necessarily know that Kamala Harris is embodying, actually, I do definitely know that Kamala Harris is not embodying the radical tradition of Fannie Lou Hamer. It's very much apparent that she is drawing on that lineage and the legacy of
Mm-hmm.
Fannie Lou Hamer in order to make a claim for what is essentially amounts to the throne of the United States.
Yeah.
So there is something different that is happening, particularly around these conversations, that is different from, say, the legacy that Barack Obama established when he ran for office. It's different from what Hillary Clinton did when she ran for office and when she was the nominee. It is unique to Black women and a Black women experience, and it's being embodied right now through Kamala Harris.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up Fannie Lou Hamer because, one of the things that I remember so vividly about that piece of film of her talking to the Credentials Committee in Atlantic City is describing being beaten in a jail. And she was beaten very, very badly in a jail. It was a beating she never recovered from. And so it's the shift from a political Black woman as an object of abuse to a political Black woman as someone who takes charge. And one of the things that the commentators are talking about this morning is how Harris just owned Trump from the very beginning, that she moved into his space, offered her hand to be shaken, and he never really recovered from that, right?
No, and I think she also did something that going on the offensive in a lot of different ways. She also did something that we don't really have the language to talk about in American politics. And I apologize, I have the hiccups, Claire.
It's okay.
I don't know where that's coming from. But one of the things that we don't talk about in American politics is the attractiveness factor.
Mhm.
I know you've written extensively on likability and the
Mhm.
likability factor, right? Particularly around women, Hillary Clinton. But one of the things that continues to happen is that Donald Trump continues to talk about Kamala Harris in terms of his level of attractiveness, his
Mhm.
attraction to her. He
Right.
described her in one instance as very beautiful. She looks like Melania. Oh my God, look at Melania. A couple of weeks later, he's like, they say is that she's so attractive. Look at her picture. I mean, it's beautiful. I think I'm more
Yeah.
attractive. But
Yeah.
he's clearly has, and she
Yeah.
understands that.
Yeah.
I think that she uses it to her advantage in order to disarm him. We don't really have a language for talking about how does someone use their attractiveness to decenter someone who is misogynistic and sexist and deeply rooted in these spaces. And yet here's Kamala Harris who's doing that. I think the other thing that is really remarkable is that we are not used to seeing Donald Trump get bullied and get his ass, pardon my French, get his ass handed to him
Yeah.
on a national stage.
Yep.
They're used to Donald Trump doing the bullying, to making people feel small. One of the things that he is
Mhm.
exceptional at is that when he is paired up against someone, the stark contrast, either an aesthetic, right? So remember that Hillary Clinton debate where he stalked her around the
Mhm.
stage and she looked small and she looked frail and he looked, tough and tall. Or these moments, I mean, the last debate in this contrast with Joe Biden and his age, he made him look superior in terms of policy and direction and vision for America. We have never seen him look so disheveled, so
Mhm.
destabilized in both aesthetic and policy. And what Kamala Harris was able to do was, from the beginning, was to set the stakes of the game and just determine what the narrative was going to be for the night. She wrote the screenplay for how this was going to play out, and it played out exactly the way that I think that she wanted it to. One last thing on this point, there's been a lot of emphasis about how we were going to see Kamala the prosecutor, and certainly we did see that. But if you know anything about prosecutors, one of the things that they do is that they often take acting and drama classes. They study the tapes, right? To use a football
Yeah.
metaphor, they sit down and they study the tapes. And I think we saw both of those things on display last night. So part of her, essentially eviscerating Trump on a policy level and on an aesthetic level was her having, I think, the performative aspect that we normally relegate to Trump. We normally say Trump is the performer, he's the showman, but
Right.
also she understood him in a way that only someone who studies his rallies, his speeches, his engagement with MAGA world would know. And that fully came out in how she laid out this plan for what was essentially a 90-minute assault on an elderly person.
I love that. I love that. I think you're absolutely right. And I think back to your point about the prosecution of this case, one of the things I noticed was particular prosecutorial techniques, one being that you show, you don't tell. In other words, you put something out before the jury and you don't tell them how to think about it. It's so obvious how to think about it that you don't need to. And you show respect for them as an audience by saying you are smart enough to know what's happening here. Also, repetition. There was a certain point in which she said, we know this, we know this, we know this. And that is, of course, how you would conclude a murder case, by simply laying out incontrovertible evidence that you have collected. I want to ask you another thing about Harris's approach last night. And I think what you're saying about how she used her attractiveness to disarm him is really important, which is her capacity to and willingness to show her emotions on her face, which normally women in politics have tried to veer toward the masculine. You know, you look stern, you don't show expressiveness. But she actually used femininity in a way that was very powerful without speaking at all. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. And so, what was really remarkable is Frank Luntz, who listeners may know, is the Republican pollster who is now a nonpartisan pollster, was doing kind of live commentary on the debate last night. And one of the things that he said early on is, he said, "Oh, she keeps making these faces. She's winning right now in personality, but if she doesn't stop the faces, I'm
Mm-hmm.
really afraid that it's going to make her look weak." And the backlash to that comment from Frank was immediate, with
Interesting.
a number of people saying, "What are you talking about? You don't actually, this is not the same critique that you give when Trump does his grunts and his,
Mhm.
he squints his eyes, or he like
Yeah.
makes his yuck face or things like that. You're reading this through a highly gendered lens." And so
Yep.
I think that is useful, actually, in thinking about how do we transform, or how do we look at what Kamala did and how it played out on her face and how she used that to her advantage. One of the things that will happen over and over again is that you, through her facial features, through her appearances, through her expressions, she can reinforce this message that she has been beating since the moment she accepted the Democratic nominee, which is that a Democratic nomination to be president of the United States, which is that Donald Trump is a deeply unserious person
Hmm.
who is a serious danger to the nation.
Right.
And so we saw this with, first it was incredulity, it was outrage, and then it was a smirk,
Yeah.
openly laughing, right? She called him a liar with her eyes. There was one point I thought she was going to call him an MFer, right? I won't actually say it. But we know that that's her favorite curse word. We know that it's her favorite curse word. And her eyes told the story.
Uh-huh.
And it was the reaction, I think, of women everywhere who have had to sit at a table with loud, boisterous, overly emotional, incoherent men,
Hmm.
and the feeling that women everywhere know, right? Those gender dynamics of having to deal with nonsense. This
Yeah.
is not a serious candidate. And yet he is in a position of power where his decisions, his actions, his incoherence will have a severe and detrimental impact to the nation. And she told that story with her face.
Yes, I agree with you completely. And, you know, one of the things I thought was interesting, and I picked this up on Twitter before the debate, is somebody said, why are all these people giving Kamala Harris advice about what to do in the debate? Nobody's giving Trump advice about what, but there were all of these white men saying, oh, she has to do this, she has to move to the center, no, she has to be more progressive. And one of the things I realized is that, of course, we have no model for what it means for a Black woman to look presidential. That simply doesn't exist. And I feel like she showed us that last night. She said, this is what it looks like to have a Black woman who's your president.
I think she told the nation that, but it's also, in the same way that she is building on a very specific lineage and legacy of, say, that's rooted in a Fannie Lou Hamer, she is also building on a legacy of Shirley Chisholm, the
Hmm.
first Black woman to run for president of the United States in 1972,
Right.
unbought and unbossed.
Yeah.
And I actually think one of the things that we don't give Shirley Chisholm enough credit for is the kind of candidacy and the kind of presidential campaign that she ran. And I think part of that is because we are so focused on the fact that the Congressional Black Caucus, right, the caucus that she is coming, political caucus that she is coming out of,
Right.
refuses to support her. The 1972 Gary Convention, which is 8,000 Black attendees of all political stripes, 3,000 Black delegates of varying political backgrounds, they refuse to support her candidacy. And so we see it, or it has been written into history as a very particular kind of candidacy, in the same way that we perhaps like a third party movement candidacy. But in fact, the kind of candidacy that Shirley Chisholm runs and then ultimately becomes part of her political brand is one that is very much in the model of how Kamala Harris styles herself many years later.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that Shirley Chisholm does is that she runs as a unifier. She proposes a rainbow coalition before Jesse Jackson
Mm-hmm.
unveils his rainbow coalition. She also approaches the presidency, her bid for the presidency, from a perspective not of what we might call radical Black feminism, which is, I think, how most people talk about it. But instead, and a lot of people don't know this, her head of domestic policy is a Black Republican, right?
Mm-hmm.
She is adamant when Black Enterprise magazine launches in 1971 that there should be progressive ways to embrace a model of the free market economy and capitalism for Black people, which is what I wouldn't call a radical position in the slightest.
Right.
Liberal, but
Right.
it's not. It's not
Right.
radical. It is very tethered towards a centrist point of view. And so I think she does this as part of a larger vision of what it means to be part of the body politic and how to run for office. So yes, we do see lots of odes to her. Hillary Clinton holds up a picture, when she accepts the nomination of Shirley Chisholm about, what does it mean to have a Black woman run for office? But here is Kamala Harris saying, I see that and I raise you one. Now
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually going to put on a performance that is rooted in this lineage, that is rooted in this legacy, and show you how to do politics. And then the last thing that I'll say here is that Kamala Harris never shies away from her racial identity. This like bizarre talking point of Trump being like, "Oh, she didn't know she was Black until a couple of years ago. Right? I thought she was Indian." That is the most bizarre thing because that is central to the narrative that she tells
Yeah.
about herself.
Yeah.
But it's also true that she no longer has to do the work of that kind of racial identity politics.
Mm-hmm.
She can have other people do it for her.
Yep.
And so there is a moment where she is telling the world, this is how Black women do politics. And she never has to say the word, I am a Black woman, because we already know it.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's really smart. And there's another word I'd like to inject in this too. And you are a scholar of Black politics. You've written a book about Black Republicans, and the word is pragmatism. Because one of the ways we talk about Black voters is that they are pragmatic voters, which means they are most frequently more moderate, with a sort of liberal social turn and so on, but also economically astute. And it seems to me that Harris is bringing that pragmatism to the stage and reintroducing it to white voters. And I thought one moment that was really terrific in that regard is when Trump challenged her on the Afghanistan withdrawal. And she just bluntly said it was the right thing to do, which is in fact reality when it comes to foreign policy, that you sometimes have to do things that have terrible, terrible consequences, and you have to do them anyway. And that is what it means to be president. So can you talk to our viewers a little bit about pragmatism and how that may play itself out in the coming weeks?
Sure. And I have to say that the Afghanistan answer, I was incredibly shocked by how well she did on that question, particularly because foreign policy is seen as a vulnerability for her. It's also
Mhm.
seen as a vulnerability for the Biden administration. There was every opportunity. It was, in essence, there's been a lot of chatter on social media about like, oh, the moderators were feeding Kamala Harris easy questions. they gave an alley-oop. I mean, that was a lob to Trump,
Right.
right?
Right.
He should have dunked it on her in 1,000 different ways.
Yep.
But this is where I think pragmatism and the contrast with presidential pragmatism and the kind of incoherence and anarchy of Donald Trump come into play, right? He couldn't do that. He didn't have the
Mhm.
ability to essentially, cut her down on the foreign policy because she undercut his argument through this use of pragmatism. And one of the things that we know about pragmatism and African Americans' use of pragmatism, which has been around for, well before the 20th century, is that particularly when you're thinking about the pursuit of power, you're operating from a position of marginality, right? Whether it be gender, race, right, national origin, sexuality, what have you, is that there's a way that people will find the most efficient path in order to get to the outcomes that they want that will help them
Right.
achieve that power. And I think for Black voters, particularly given that they have rarely had very real political power, I think they've had political influence in the American two party system. But in terms of
Right.
political power, they have been largely at a disadvantage.
Right.
um, they are consistently thinking about what are the fastest paths, what are the easiest, or not easiest, but the most straightforward paths, and what are the most efficient pathways to get what I want out of this system? What are the things that need to be done? So I would not be surprised to see the kind of pragmatism and the kind of centrism that was demonstrated by Barack Obama during his presidency, 2008 to 2016, end up being adopted by Kamala Harris. But I also think it's true that her kind of pragmatism is certainly tinged by the fact that she is a woman and that she is pulling from a different political legacy than
Mhm.
Barack Obama. So again, I have to bring it back to Shirley Chisholm because as much as we want to quantify Shirley Chisholm as part of this like Black feminist radical tradition, which she is, it is also true that she is part of a larger Black pragmatic political tradition,
Mhm.
one in which she's thinking about what are the most efficient um, pathways to access to resources to power for Black people in America in the aftermath of the essentially what amounts to the end of the protest aspect of the civil rights movement.
Yep.
Right. So she says in '68, after she is elected to Congress, and she says also in her autobiography that she always feared that it would be as Malcolm X said, it had to be the ballot or the bullet. And she felt like working within the system would allow her to be revolutionary in a way, but also understood that that necessitated a certain amount of compromise.
Mhm.
So, what she's doing is she is prepping us for a kind of Black politics that embraces pragmatism and embraces what is a centerpiece of American democracy, which is compromise, which is largely
Mhm.
at odds with revolutionary aims, right? The point of democracy, when democracy is functioning well, is that it takes those fringe ideas and moves them toward the center. But it also allows, I think, the most vulnerable people to have a voice within the larger system. So here we have a Shirley Chisholm prepping us for that moment.
Yeah.
And here we have many moons later, Kamala Harris showing and telling us this is how it's done.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's a great way of putting it. And, you know, what you talk about in terms of like what's the most efficient path forward, one of the things I noticed last night is that Harris did not take the bait around racism, not just in relation to her and her identity, but there were two other key moments. One was when Trump kept referring to the head of the Taliban as Abdul, which is not his name. That's like a cartoon name for an Arab person, a generic Arab person. Viewers, I will include the name of the real head of the Taliban in the notes. But the other is this story about Haitian immigrants eating your household pets, which of course is ragingly racist, I would also like to say it is a piece of Russian propaganda that has appeared repeatedly in Europe, most notably in Ukraine prior to the Russian invasion, but also as part of the anti-immigrant rhetoric in Europe. So Harris did not pause on those things. She was just like, we're going to keep moving because that's not important. That's not about me. That's about you. And, I thought her constant reiteration that this election was not about her, it was about us, was very, very powerful.
It was incredibly powerful. And so there is a multi-layered response, I think, in how Harris deals with race that is deserving of all of the attention, right? Like, yes, we should add in gender and we should try and understand, how is she handling gender and race in really interesting ways. But her use of race and her ability to kind of sidestep the trap, I think, or what we would think of as the trap of identity politics, and actually pull Donald Trump into a narrative whereby he is the purveyor of identity politics is really quite masterful.
Right.
Is in it is exceptional in a way that I don't even think that Barack Obama had the ability to do. And so we see this kind of in a couple of places. One, she absolutely set him up for that. Haitian migrants are coming to your town and eating dogs and cats. And one of the things that we saw in the lead up to last night's debate was that several really high profile figures within the Republican Party, namely J.D. Vance, right, the
Mhm.
vice presidential nominee for president of the United States, but also Ted Cruz, several other really prominent people were taking these fringe ideas about a very specific population of migrants, Black Haitian migrants who have come under kind of Trump's attention before in really pejorative and negative ways. I think it was the quote from 2017, "shithole countries."
Yes.
Right, which actually had Mia Love, the congresswoman from Utah who is of Haitian descent, right, say that the president's remarks were disgraceful.
Mhm.
But we see this moment where these ideas, these fringe ideas that, as you pointed out, Claire, are, Russian disinformation and misinformation, really kind of like dark recesses of the internet
Mhm.
that have no business in mainstream politics. We see them getting picked up. We see them getting disseminated. They become part of surrogacy rhetoric. They become part of rallies where people are telling each other. And I think, again, Kamala Harris is someone who is studying the tape. She knows what they are saying at these rallies. She knows what they are
Right.
saying in these circles. And she baits him. She
Mhm.
essentially says, tell us what you're thinking. And he goes for hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah.
And what is remarkable about this moment is that it's such a ludicrous, right? Absolutely astonishing piece of misinformation that is simultaneously a dog whistle, right? And it is speaking to a certain cross section of Americans who are watching the debate, who are part of the MAGA base, but also it's so stunning in its disinformation that
Right.
David Muir, the moderator, steps in and says, actually, that is misinformation. And
Yes.
I spoke to the town official who was like, this never happened.
Right.
And Trump says, yes, it did. People are talking. Actually, no, I'm going to correct you. And
Right.
so if the listeners will recall, there were very few moments that the moderators stepped in
Right.
to correct or to fact check. But one of those big moments was this creep in of the question of race and xenophobia, right? Like this really ugly intersection. So, what does it do? What does that moment do? It alienates this group that Donald Trump has allegedly been working to woo over, right? It
Mhm.
forces these very old ideas that Donald Trump has about racism. And it allows Kamala Harris to simply look and say, again, a deeply unserious man who is using these kind of like nefarious ideas and pulling them onto a debate stage, things that should be left in the recesses or the garbage heap
Yep.
of political discussion. They have no business being here.
Yeah.
American people, look what he's doing. I'm
Yep.
speaking to you. She also does this when the moderator brought up the question about Donald Trump. You have repeatedly talked about Kamala's race. And he gives this kind of really awful and disrespectful answer. And she again says, you know what? This is ridiculous that we're having this conversation. I've never shied away from conversations about who I am or my identity as a biracial American. But instead, this tracks with this longer history of race and racism and bigotry
Right.
that Donald Trump has displayed. But then she pivoted, and I think this is key. This is a key difference between how Biden, but also really Hillary Clinton attacked the question of race, because everyone has heard people attack. Everybody knows that Donald Trump is racist, right?
Right.
Something like 85% of Americans know. They're like, oh yeah, Donald Trump is racist. We all know this at this point. She pivots and she says, I want to give you a vision of uniting America. She pivoted to something positive.
Right.
And she sidesteps the question of race as it addresses her. So it doesn't become her albatross.
Right.
It
Right.
doesn't become her identity. It becomes something that is part of
Right.
this larger, divisive, selfish problem of
Yep.
Donald Trump. And I think that is deeply remarkable. And it reminds me, again, this is where it gets, I think, a little interesting on the Black politics side of things, not necessarily of the lineage that we've been pulling from, the Shirley Chisholm, but instead this other lineage of a figure like Massachusetts Senator Edward Brooke, who is the
Mhm.
first black senator to be popularly elected to the Senate, and he's elected in 1966.
Right.
His ability to walk this tightrope of race and to do it in really effective ways that appeal to a multiracial audience that is
Yep.
key to victory is something that 100% Kamala Harris is pulling from.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And as we're moving to the wrap up and our viral moments, I also want to say that upon reflection, part of what I loved about last night's debate is that Harris is growing rapidly. She entered this race as a mature politician, and as someone who clearly knew how to handle herself. But what we're seeing is this sort of accelerated growth, something you normally see during a primary process, an intra-party primary process. Um, and she's growing very quickly, whereas Trump has not just flatlined, he's deteriorated. And for any of us who have been watching him the last 8 or 9 years, I mean, I actually have seen a number of his rallies live. He's a very, very different person. And it's difficult not to see the contrast between someone who is old and on the way out and someone who is young and on the way up.
Right. And I think in 2016, he was the insurgent.
Right.
He was the outsider. He was the wild card. And Americans love a good, change agent.
Yep.
This is an election that is in 2024 is about change. And right now, Kamala Harris has that momentum. Despite the fact that she is the vice president of the United States, the current and sitting vice president of the United States,
Right.
she has managed to write a very public narrative that says, I am the insurgent, I am the outsider. And I don't know if this counts as like our viral moment or the moment I want to go viral, the one I want to
Go for it. Go for it.
is that Kamala Harris went into this with 30%, nearly 30% of Americans saying, we want to know more about her and we want to know what she stands for, right? Like, what are her policies with the belief
Yep.
that, well, Donald Trump has a policy vision for America.
Yep.
She changed the terms of the debate.
Mm.
Debate is radically different going
Yep.
forward. And we
Yep.
saw this in snap polling and things like that. Independents are saying, no, actually, I learned a lot about her in this debate. Actually, I
Right.
think she won. And I think that she laid out a policy vision.
Yep.
Now, what's happening, and I think this is masterful politically, she has changed the terms of the debate and the narrative surrounding the debate to this moment where it's Donald Trump who is incoherent. It is Donald
Mhm.
Trump who is a byproduct of establishment politics.
Right.
More of the same, the divisiveness, the ugliness. And I think of that moment. This is my viral moment. That moment towards the end of the debate where Trump says, and he was talking about the Affordable Care Act and Republican replacements. He says, I have concepts of a plan.
Mhm.
And to me, that is the moment that it became apparent that there is no cohesive vision,
Mhm.
that this man has gone off the rails, that all of this stuff that she's been reinforcing since that moment she walked out on stage and shook his hand, right? All 5'4" of her walking over to all 6'2" of him saying, here we go, right? That really awkward moment. This is where it all comes into play,
Yep.
where now we are saying, and I told my students in the lead up to this, I said, everybody wants to know, what is Kamala Harris's plan? Everybody wants to know, like, policy, who is she? I think we should be asking that question of Donald Trump, because if we do a little bit of pushing, we're going to see there's not much coherence there. There's not
Yep.
much there.
Yep.
Because exactly, he revealed to America that there is nothing. There's transaction. There's a naked, ugly hunger for power at the cost of grievance politics, at the
Mhm.
cost of dividing America. But in terms of, a plan, a vision for America, I
Yep.
have concepts of a plan, aka
Yep.
nothing. That is the moment. That is the viral moment. That I
Right.
want to go viral. That
Yep.
should be going viral. The one that we should all pin on him. And so far, it looks like my favorite so far that I've seen is someone saying, I have concepts of a book manuscript, right?
Right.
Concepts of a lecture for my class today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see how this plays out, right?
Let's.
I have concepts of a job that I'm supposed to be doing.
Right.
There's nothing actually there.
Right. Right.
Absolutely brilliant. She couldn't have scripted it better herself.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And I'm going to pick another moment from the debate that I want to go viral, which is the first time she called Donald Trump a disgrace. I felt this huge exhale from around the country of somebody finally saying to him, you are the emperor, you've got no clothes on. And you are a disgrace, and we are ashamed of you, and you should be ashamed of yourself. And it was a kind of truth telling that doesn't rely on a dispute about facts. It relies on something not only we should all know, but that his supporters, and, let's be clear, we're not actually speaking to his supporters right now. We're speaking to the 15 to 18% of voters that we need to push Kamala Harris over the top. But it's speaking to those supporters and saying, he is a disgrace. Think about it. You just think about it. So that's what I want to go viral. But I want to end by asking you one question. Did you let your daughter stay up late to watch the debate?
No, I did not. No, I did not.
You're such a good mother.
However, I think this speaks to the question of what is happening in the moment. I absolutely know that when I speak to my daughter later today, she's going to mention Taylor Swift. And Taylor Swift, the childless cat lady's endorsement
Yes.
of Kamala Harris for president.
Yes.
And normally, we don't, my daughter's not going to say all this stuff. This is stuff I'm going to add in there.
Mm-hmm.
Normally, we do not care about celebrity endorsements, right? Nobody
Mm-hmm.
cares that Kid Rock has endorsed Donald Trump.
Right.
No one really cares that Chrissy Teigen has endorsed Kamala Harris. Taylor Swift, though, one of the most influential people in the world right now,
Mm-hmm.
actually has the power to mobilize young people in ways that politics has had a very difficult time reaching. And
Yep.
pure proof positive of this is that my 11-year-old and my 9-year-old child are going to be asking me about, did you know that Taylor Swift endorsed Kamala Harris?
Yes.
Oh, what do you think about that?
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
like, oh no, the election has come home. All right.
There we go. And with that, Leah Wright Rigueur, thank you so much for making time in your schedule for us this morning. And viewers, there will be show notes. And Leah, I hope we see you again on the show.
Oh, anytime, please. I'd love to come back.